fellow, prior to that, a fellow of King's College in Cambridge, and was also, for some years, an economist at the World Bank in South Africa. He started his interest, I think his PhD thesis was on missing women in part, in which he produced estimates, more sophisticated estimates of the number of missing women than Amartya had done in his New York Review of Books paper. He's interested in labor issues, development economics issues, and so on. Stephan.
Well, thanks very much. And I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here at the launch of this initiative, and I think it is addressing a bunch of very interesting questions and issues that are very well worth studying, and I wish the initiative all success. My comments are largely complementary to François', so I will try to, I agree with most of what he said, and will just add a few more issues which I will hopefully help stimulate the debate. First, generally, I think it's quite clear that by now this kind of human development capability approach is now dominant in development economics as a concept for the measurement of well-being, and I think it's great that it is. I think it has enriched both analysis as well as policy debates a great deal. A critical shortcoming has been that in this approach it has much greater data requirements to come up with decent ways of measuring capabilities, decent ways of measuring human development, and critical dimensions are entirely missing. So what we spend too much time on is actually recycling the old data that we all have to create ever sophisticated measures of human development or capabilities, but we're not actually pushing the frontier further to try to address dimensions where we actually do not have any data. In that sense, I think this process here is particularly valuable to try to push the envelope a little bit further, try to gain new understanding on dimensions where we all agree that they are important, but we don't have data. Recently I was involved in this an initiative with UNDP on revisiting their gender-related indicators, and the question was, the problem was once again, yes, here are 3 or 4 dimensions we want to measure in the gender field, but there are no internationally comparable data. Similarly, I was just last week in an OECD meeting on similar issues, exactly the same problem. So I think this is very, very valuable. Let me make a few general remarks, and then I will comment on some of the dimensions. I think one critical general remark is these survey instruments have to be seen as add-ons to the existing household surveys, because they will only make sense if you can correlate what the new dimension that you have with the existing data, such as income, such as employment, and all the kind of other things that are in the household surveys. And obviously makes the thing very challenging, because you need to interact with the people who are generating these surveys to make sure that you can add on these modules. A second issue is, if you look at all of the indicators proposed, there's a great deal of indicator heterogeneity in the way they are constructed. We have scales from 1 to 10, or from 1 to 6, or yes-no questions. We have ordinal scales, we have cardinal scales, we have some continuous variables, we have some discrete variables. If you're actually going to somehow try to put them together to come up with multi-dimensional indices or multivariate measures, or even try to compare across dimensions, this heterogeneity can pose serious problems. So I think more thought is needed to really consider every single indicator you're proposing and see how it would fit in a multidimensional assessment. And often the easiest may be to stick to yes-no questions in different dimensions, rather than having 6-point ordinal scales and then aggregate them to 10-point cardinal scales or yes-no questions in a third dimension. So this is clearly an agenda that needs to be taken forward to refine these types of measures. Third general comment is clearly one-shot surveys in these types of dimensions will not do, because often you will find interesting correlations which we all liked and which we all probably will believe, and maybe we'll all get them published as well. But I think if you really want to understand something about well-being and want to understand something about policy, it's going to have to be panel surveys. we now have too many cross-sectional surveys on the determinants of income and happiness, so the correlation between income and happiness. What we need is panel data to really understand changes over time. And I think with most of these missing dimensions that you mentioned, only panel data will generate results. So I think it's much better to have 2 panel surveys, convince 2 countries to add it to a panel survey, than to have 20 countries added to their cross-sectional survey, where I don't think you will add some interesting correlations but no information on causation. Now, let me just go through some of the dimensions that were mentioned, all of which I find very, very important. I have it in a slightly different order, so let me just do it as I had it here. On psychological well-being, I think clearly in subjective well-being this is a useful addition. But one of the indicators you proposed had to do with meaning in life. Now that's obviously a very broad question, and I think if one thinks about this as a missing dimension of poverty, I think one needs to control for the impact religiosity and spirituality more generally has on the meaning of life, because I think what you're interested in is in what sense poverty affects your sense of meaning, and if you don't know what the spirituality background, religiosity background is, I think this is an issue. On the safety and security, I think these are useful and critical indicators. The problem here is not so much the survey instrument, the problem is how to actually get reliable information. I think on domestic violence this is particularly the problem. So I think on surveys we already know pretty well what kind of information we want. There was a process with the WHO UN working group on measuring domestic violence that was finished last year that generated very useful information on this. I think it's much more about the interview strategy, how you're eliciting reliable information than just about the questionnaire. Also, I think in general it's much easier in this violence area to get qualitative assessments on a household basis than quantitative assessments. So you can get senses of fear, insecurity. Those I think I would develop more than the quantitative ones where I have some serious doubts that you will get reliable data in the end. Third area, employment. I think it was mentioned how critical it is, and I fully agree. I think one of the things that wasn't mentioned is in those happiness surveys, unemployment across the world, developing or rich country, is the single most important economic driver of unhappiness everywhere, which is an extremely robust result. So I think that's an extremely important piece of information to justify inclusion of this. Here, I have a slightly different problem, however. Before focusing on the quality of work, I would like to first try to get internationally comparable and reliable data on the quantity of work. Now, we have this data in principle. We have the LaborStar database, which is official statistic, which I think is highly unreliable. I think there are inconsistencies across time, across space, and it's very difficult to work with these data. At the same time, we have the micro surveys, which could be used to generate reliable quantity of work data on wages, on employment, on unemployment. And the World Bank has used these micro-surveys to create roughly reliable data on poverty and make them publicly available. I think my plea would be if the World Bank, the ILO, or maybe both together, were actually using these micro-data to create reliable, internationally comparable data on wages, employment, unemployment, and so on, and make them publicly available, for example, the World Development Indicators, I think we would be a giant leap forward. And only then, I think the question of quality of work indicators, where I think these additions are useful, would then become relevant. I think it's important to broaden the concept of work, particularly when we're thinking about overwork. It is not people. There are some people who are overworked in formal employment. In developing countries, that's probably the minority, and maybe by choice. I think in the majority of overworked in non-formal employment, in domestic work, and so on. I think some questions on the total time use, I think, is going to be extremely cool. On the issues of shame, stigma, and humiliation, I think, yes, it's a critical aspect of well-being, and I think the Adam Smith story is extremely important as a story to tell. I think the Voices of the Poor story book has indicated the importance of stigma and humiliation for the poor. But the problem in the type of indicators that we proposed is that they're trying to measure shame, stigma, and humiliation somewhat more generally, and not so much focusing on the poverty aspects of it. So, for example, shame proneness is one issue that is being information is being elicited. I think this is mostly related to, or likely most related to, a kind of more general psychological condition in a particular cultural context. And in that sense, it was interesting. I was at a seminar this morning to see that they tried it out in Bolivia, and it didn't actually correlate at all with socioeconomic information as shame proneness indicator. And I think one should need to focus it on the aspects of shame and stigma that are directly related to poverty rather than a generalized psychological indicator here, and also here panel-based. But I think the thing that is missing here is actually to take up Adam Smith's story and try to implement it, which is what aspects of poverty are associated with stigma. That, I think, is a very, very interesting question to ask. Adam Smith famously said not having leather shoes caused stigma in Scotland, although apparently he said not in France, at least at the time, where he said wooden shoes would do. I don't think that's still the case, but that's the kind of issue that we need to focus on. Is it clothing that causes stigma? Is it the inability to have ceremonies, weddings, funerals? Is it the need to beg for help from public or private sources? Is it the housing conditions? What are the things that are causing the stigma associated with poverty? I think that would be really, really interesting, and we don't have that information at the moment. Lastly, on empowerment, clearly a critical area, and for poverty, measuring the agency aspects of well-being. Here I have a few suggestions. I think on the domestic empowerment, there were a few important issues, particularly from a gender perspective, that were missing. For example, who decides whether I am allowed to go out and meet people? Who do I have the freedom to decide on my own to leave for work? Do I have who makes production decisions? In African agriculture, the household is a producing unit. Who decides what to plant, what to sell, and so on? On political empowerment, I think here at the moment the focus is very much on rather abstract notions of holding local politicians accountable. I'm not sure is going to yield very reliable answers. I think I would try to focus it more concretely and also link it to policy. For example, try to elicit the ability of individuals to claim public services. Are you able to claim health services you're entitled to? Are you able to claim education services you're entitled to? Are you able to claim social security payments, conditional cash transfer payments, or whatever? Those are the kind of important areas. I think there was a very interesting World Development Report 2004 on making services work for poor people. That type of information that was generated there, I think, would be extremely useful. Lastly, economic empowerment is here focused on access to credit. I think economic empowerment is a much broader issue. It has to do with factors of production, who controls factors of production, land, inputs, technologies, and credit is just one element of that. And so I would broaden the story here a little bit in terms of empowerment. So these are just a few kind of scattered comments. I think generally this is all of these dimensions we are sorely in need of greater and better information. So I hope that they will be successful in convincing the survey designers and survey makers to add some modules on these particular dimensions so that in a few years' time we have a better understanding of poverty from such a multidimensional perspective for better understanding, but also for the design of better policies. Thanks.